Hi, Georgette again, Cars here, and I just wanted to do a video today on watercolors and how to use them. So first, let's just start with what is watercolors and what's the difference between oils and acrylics. So basically, when you look at a watercolor, you'll notice that a lot of the color is on the canvas, which we're painting on, which would be our watercolor paper, is very light and diluted. It doesn't have like a lot of texture. Although I did do a textured watercolor class and I wrote a book about that, of how you can work with the watercolors with less water and different solvents to build it up. But the traditional watercolors, you're only using water. You're not using anything like another solvent. For an example, if you are using oils where you might have terp or Gamsol or zested, or whatever you're going to be, or damas, or a varnish or something, whatever you're going to be adding to your oils. Or if you were working with acrylics, you would also be working with water, but it's a different type of medium because acrylics are a little bit thicker and they're also, polymer based. So that's made the major difference. They do have watercolor sets that are just as exquisite as the oils and acrylics, where they have lots of color in them and lots of choices from different colors, to the sets that just have basic colors, just or what are in the color wheel. So it's up to you to decide. So the first thing I tell students is they have to choose what kind of watercolor set that they want. And the watercolors that you're probably used to are when you were a child, if you were painting in those little, they have the colors in those little round wells. That's okay. But the only thing with those watercolors are the color is not very strong and you have to keep cleaning your brush. So when you're using those wells, you have to kind of take your brush, dip it in the water, wipe it off on a rag, pick up the color, put it on your watercolor paper, and then keep dipping your brush in the water and wiping it off on the rag and picking up another color. You also have to move the color somewhere else. So most people, when they're doing that, they're just kind of picking up the colors and then moving it on the paper because they don't have that as a separate palette. It's a little bit hard to move that paint because you're just moving it, with your brush somewhere else. But it is possible, obviously, to do even if you're working in the block watercolors. The more popular watercolors that they have are the ones that come in the tubes. And the reason why is because when you have the ones that are the ones that you're used to that you might have used as a child, they bleed very easily. And if you're painting outside, you're painting plein air, the colors might run together because they're so close together in those blocks. But if you have the watercolors that are in the tube, that really doesn't happen because they're separate. And I'll show you what I mean here. So here's a watercolor set, right? And they have these little tubes. Now, you're not getting less of the watercolor because you're getting a tiny tube. Watercolors, you don't use as much as you would with the oils or the acrylics. And you can see the color's pretty intense. It's a little bit different than if you just had those little watercolors when you were a kid, when you were playing with them. Also, they can have more extensive colors, and you have a variety of colors that you can work with based if you were just using those the ones that come in the well or the blocks. The other thing that is good is the watercolor pencils. So sometimes students will use the watercolor pencils, and what they like about these pencils are the fact that if you like to draw, you can draw, and you can take a brush and pull out the color. So let me show you what I mean. So here's just a regular piece of watercolor paper I have, and I'm going to let's take out this red here. I'm just going to put a red line, and you can see how I'm kind of drawing that red line. And then I can take a brush, and I can wipe it in water, and on my rag, and I can just pull that color out. Do you see how that color just pulls out with the pencil? So you have the option of drawing. It's also, a good way to do gradients. If you want to practice going from light to dark, you can see that just with this little bit of brush, I was able to go, this was the main stroke here, and then I have it light, then I have medium and dark. So it's very easy to work with, and it's very easy to pull out the color. and all you need is a pencil sharpener. And if you do draw well, I really recommend them. They don't make any kind of mess anyway. If you're using the tubes, you have to have a palette where you have to put the paint on and then remove it. Take your brush, dip it in the palette, and remove it to the canvas paper here, the watercolor paper. But with these pencils, you don't need that. You can just draw and just move out the line. So that's another option for students that have those type A personalities where everything has to be neat. The watercolor pencils are the way to go. And they come in a bunch of different colors. Sometimes students will buy the watercolor pencils and they will also have tube watercolors so they can draw. Or sometimes they might do drawing with different color markers and combine the watercolor pencils in this manner, or they might just have markers and regular watercolors. So it's basically up to you. But the thing that I want you to know is you do have the options for having a beautiful, varied kind of palette and different colors, whether you're using the watercolor pencils or the watercolors that come in the tube, or the well. Remember, if you're using the block or the well, it's just a different process because you have to dip your paint in the water and you don't want to saturate your brush too much. If you put too much water on your brush, what happens and you go directly to the paper without dabbing it out on a rag, your paper is going to be all crinkly and you're not going to like it. It's going to bubble. It's too much water on the watercolor paper. So I always tell students to take a tiny bit of water. You really don't need that much water. If you want to have a palette for watercolors, and again, your palette is where you would take the paint to move it to the watercolors, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if you have tubes, most students have palettes, and there's tons of different types of palettes. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger, but it's basically where you're taking the watercolors and where you're moving them. So you can't, you know, you have to lie the watercolor paper on something, otherwise it doesn't work. What are you going to put the paints on for them to work? So this is my palette here, and you see I have these spaces where I can take my watercolors that are tubes that I had in these little tubes here that I showed you. I'll remind you again so you can see what the tubes look like. And again, the tubes come in various sizes, but that's tube. And I'll take that color and I'll put it here. So therefore, what I can do is when I want to paint, I can dip my brush in the water, wipe it off on a rag, pick up the color, and go directly to the canvas. And if I want to mix the colors, I can take the color here, like say for an example, I wanted to mix this blue and this ochre yellow. I could wet my brush, pick up the blue, move it here, you see, and then wet my brush and pick up the yellow ochre and move it here, and I could blend it together and I could have that one color here and then move it to my watercolor paper. It makes the process easier. You do have to remember, but when you're using these palettes, is that you have to take your brush and you have to clean it in between. So you're not moving it with a palette knife like if you're using oils and acrylics. You're using a brush. So that means that I'll show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to dip my brush in my water and I'm going to wipe it off on a rag. I'm just wiping it off. And what I can do is I'm going to pick up some of this blue here, you see, and I'm moving the blue here, okay? If I go directly to the yellow, I'm going to contaminate the yellow with this blue that I have on the back of this brush. So I have to wash off the brush, wipe it off on the rag, and then I have to go to the yellow, and then I can put the yellow here. So do you see now I have a yellow and a blue? And then I can mix them together, and now I get a green, okay? But you really don't want to go dip your, paint in any of these colors or any of your colors and mix them. Like I don't want to go here and then dip it in here because those two colors will mix together, and what will happen is you'll destroy each color, and you want to keep each color pure so you're always able to mix. Okay, so I'll show you again. Say for an example, I want a brown, I'd go to the brown and I'd put the brown here, take my brush, I'd clean it, And then I'd have to think about what color I'm going to pick up. Maybe I'm going to pick up some yellow, and then I put the yellow here, and then I can combine them and I get that color. Okay, so the palette makes it easier. If you don't have the palette, then you have to do it on your watercolor paper, and you'd have to keep cleaning your brush, wiping it off, and doing that. So the palette is necessary. The other thing, and students say, well, if I don't have a palette, what can I do? You can go to the store and you can buy um, an ice cube tray. Okay, so an ice cube tray, the little small ice cube trays that have small ice cubes, that works really well because the colors don't mix together and they have these separation grooves. But these palettes are very inexpensive. You can even get them like at the dollar store or the Euro store. So that's one thing that you do need, a palette. If you have some watercolor kits come with a palette, it might not be this large, but some water kits come with a palette. But if you're using the wells, like when you were a little kid, sometimes they do have a palette in the middle, so they'll have the colors going around in a circle, and in the middle of that, they'll have a well where you can mix it. The really inexpensive sets don't have that. They're sometimes just square and they just have the colors, maybe like 6 colors, and they have no place to mix it. So if that's your case, you do want to get a palette. Okay, the next thing that I want to show you with watercolors are the brush is important. So I'll put the brushes down below, but the mop brush is the most important brush. And that brush is shaped in different ways. You'll have a large mop brush, and then you have the brush that kind of comes to the point. I really like that brush because you have a variation where you could use it as a wash brush to encompass a large surface area, or you can use it for detail where it comes to a point. Do you see how this brush is wide, right? But it comes to a point. But look, when I press down, the brush will open up. So the other thing is watercolor brushes come in different varies of different types of hair. They have like a cat's tongue. They also have like the squirrel hair. You don't have to do that. Like a lot of people don't want to, of course, buy those brushes for those reasons, but they do have synthetic brushes that work very well. And I'll put a link below to some of those brushes, or I'll do another video on brushes, which I've done before if you look on my YouTube channel. So I want to show you something with the watercolors. So when I have this color here, it's kind of not like acrylics because when acrylics dry, they're just dry, right? Once the color is on the canvas, you can't really pull it out anymore unless it's wet. With oils, they stay wet for a certain amount of time. But with acrylics, they also stay wet, where you can pull it out. Or, so let's say I can still work with that color and I'll blend it a little bit more. Okay. The other thing is I can move it over here very lightly. Did it very, very lightly. That's why a lot of people like acrylics because you can rework them. The other thing that you need with acrylics are you need a sponge. You need a sponge because with acrylics, with the watercolors, you sometimes have so much paint on the canvas. If you put, too much paint on when I say canvas, I mean your watercolor paper here. You're putting too much paint, you want to remove it off. So I'll show you ways that you can do that. I use a regular sea sponge, and it's good for dabbing and pulling off the color. If you want to pull off the color another way, you can just also use a rag, but a clean rag, right? You don't want to use a dirty rag. And you want to use your brush. And when you use your brush, I'll show you how to do it. So let's pretend this is the color again. I'm going to put it here. Okay. And let's just say, and these are watercolor pencils again. I have that much and I don't want it. What I would have to do is dip my brush in the water, wipe it off on the rag, and I pull it out. Dip it on, and I don't want to keep dipping the brush in the water and just putting directly the water here because the paper is going to crinkle. So I dip it in the water, wipe it off on the rag, and then what I do is then I keep pulling it out, and I keep doing that until I want it to be lighter. And I don't have that much water on the brush. I'm dabbing it off, and I'm just pulling it out. I could also pull it out with a rag, okay? And that's helpful when you do make a mistake. They do have white with watercolors where you could paint on top. Most people do not do that. They also have masking fluid. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the type of paper and what to do. Sometimes when you go shopping in the store, you'll see watercolors that come in a pad. So there's different papers within that pad and you can pull them out. Usually I don't do that. I leave them in there because the backing, I have something to paint on and it's kind of a strong backing. And if I remove the watercolor paper from the pad, I have to tape it down to a board, okay? Because I need some kind of backing to work with the paper, even if you have it flat on your desk, right? Um, so what I do is I have painter's tape, or I just have regular watercolor tape. The watercolor tape is like gum tape, so it's this color brown, and it works with the watercolor paper. And the reason why I prefer that tape and the painter's tape is because when you tape your watercolor to the board, so I might have a border here. The other good thing about the tape, right, is if you tape it around here, when you remove it, you might have like a little white edge, which made a little frame. But the good thing that I really do like about taping it to the board, or the most important thing is, you can wet the paper ahead of time. So usually, if I want to do a scene where I want a lot of texture, I don't wet the paper. And by wetting the paper, I mean I would take a large watercolor brush and I would dip it in water, wipe it off on my rag, and then move it to the canvas and move it all the way across here and do what I call a wash. And when I do that, it makes the paper, how can I say, when I put the mark on, the paper will be a little bit more easier to move the brush and it's less texturized. But if I don't do that, then I would have the mark and it would be more texturized. In other words, the water is going to make, the strokes look a little bit more smoother here. Okay, I'm sorry, but today it's 95 degrees where I live. I don't have on the fan. I have the windows closed because where I live, there's a lot of noise from the trucks. So, and then cars passing and stuff. And if I leave the windows open, um, the you'll hear it on the video. And I don't put on the air conditioner for the noise. So I'm really hot in here. So, but I want to make this video for you anyway. So I do want to talk to you about, so again, you would just kind of press the tape, around the sides, and then you can wet the paper. So let me show you how I would do that with a wash. So again, here's our beautiful, paper, okay? And here is a wash. So this is kind of like a study that I just did in 2 seconds to put the color on. So I'll show you, and I guess I'm going to do it here on the back here, and what I mean by a wash. So as you know, I have my brush. I'm going to dip it. I'm going to wipe it off on my rag, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of blue, and I'm going to move it across the canvas here, the watercolor paper. And do you see how I do that so light and so easy? You need to really practice your washes, and you can practice gradients where you can have it going from dark to light like I did here, or just like this. You can also practice how you would do your washes on top of each other. So here I'm going to start with a light yellow. Okay, you see it? Make it a little bit darker for the camera. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer on top of that maybe some green. Okay, so I'm going to have some green. And then I'm going to put a little bit more green just so you can see it here. Okay, you can see that gradient, and you really want to practice laying colors on top of each other because you can see the yellow and then you can see the green. And the other thing with watercolors is you do want to do the light color first and then the darker color on top. So if I was doing layers, I want to start with the yellow and then put the green on top. I don't want to put the green and then the yellow on top. Okay, the other thing that I kind of like about these palettes are you don't have to carry a lot of paints with you. You can leave the house and kind of just put your colors here and close this. And then when you're working, all you have to do is just bring this in your brushes and your watercolor paper, and you don't have much to carry at all. Okay, so again, practice your washes, and you're going to do the continuous palette like I think I spoke about earlier. So what and I wrote in one of my books what the continuous palette is. So it's basically starting, say, with this blue, and then adding a yellow, and then we have a green, then adding another color, red, and then it has all these colors. We just pick one color and we're adding another color, another color, and another color. And I think I explained to you in the beginning of this video, that's how it makes my watercolors work so well. So when I did this is the exact palette for this. And again, you don't have to do, I do a lot of watercolors that are very realistic that I sell here. You don't have to do the realistic watercolors, but I do encourage students to learn realism, because when you're learning realism, you're learning how to use the brush, you're learning different strokes, and then if you want to do something that's abstract, which I also do, this is kind of like an abstract scene, you can choose to do that. But or you can choose, sometimes I have the students where I did something that was monochromatic. Of course, it takes a longer amount of time for me to do the realism, but I would encourage you to first do your washes and do your color swatches. And again, if you wanted to learn more about watercolors, I write books. Again, I think I told you this in the beginning. This one's about almost 500 pages, so I write maybe about 2 textbooks a year. This is plein air painting, and it has everything you wanted to know about oils, watercolors, and acrylics, painting on location. And this is oils, acrylics, and watercolors. And I'm actually writing my 26th book now. It's a surprise what it's going to be on, but it is an art book. And I'll let you know that. But each of the art book, all of the books, for an example, I tell you about the brushes step by step. I show you what the brush looks like. I give you a definition of the brush, how the brush should be used, different types of watercolors, the brush size, from different types of palette knife to, all these color mixing examples, to exercises that you really need, that you want to do to explore texture, form, if we're working in composition. And again, they're all oils, acrylics, and watercolors. So if you want to do that, you can check my books out. They are also in libraries around the United States and Europe, and I do it as a free service. So the other thing, so let's get moving on for the watercolors. So once you've done your swatches and you chose your watercolor paper, whether you're going to choose a smooth watercolor paper or it's going to be a little bit texturized where they have hot or a cold press, you're going to look at the type of watercolor paper and you'll decide, well, I want to do something with, I'll show you up close. So you can see this one's a little smoother. Can't really see the texture. Do you see how rough? This is a little bit more rough, and it has more of a texture edge. And they have ones that are in between. The other thing about a watercolor paper is the weight. So, if you're in Europe, they'll measure it by grams, right? And I think I have an American one here. If you're in America, they're going to measure this, you'll see, by pounds, like 140. And this is kind of typical, okay, for the paper. It's really good. You'll have to decide again if you want it hot or cold press, smooth. If you want to mount it down, wet it, where you get a smoother transition. Once you've chose your watercolor paper, once you've chose your type of watercolors, whether they're going to be in the tube, the block, or the well, the next thing is, and you chose your brushes, right? The next thing is, and you've done these exercises that I've kind of explained to you. The next thing is you want to start moving along to the next step. And the next step would be to try different techniques. So in my classes, I do have the students paint various kind of scenes. So I'm going to show you something now, a couple of things, and we'll do it together. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of techniques that you would need to do with the watercolors. Okay, so I'm trying to think which one I want to start with because there's so many of them. Okay. let's start. I'm going to mask this down here. So I have this here. Now I would take this down and I would decide, remember, if I'm going to dip my brush in water and wipe it off. Why? If I wanted it to be a smooth. If I wanted the colors to kind of blend together. If I didn't want that, I could have the rough textured paper. So let's do it with the rough textured paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this little watercolor pencil and I'm going to draw something. So give me 2 seconds. And I'm going to, and you don't have to do it with a watercolor pencil. You could do it with a marker if you wanted to. Um, it's basically up to you. You could do it with a very light pencil. I'll show you, I have my beautiful drawing pencils here that I always use. I really recommend getting a very good set of drawing pencils. They will change your life. And the reason why is because the pencils also go according to different types of weight. So you might have a stroke that will be a little bit thicker, one that will be a little bit thinner, depending on what kind of pencil that you're going to use. But for now, I am just going to do it with this watercolor pen. So give me 1 second. I'm going to draw this super fast. And I think I'm going to do, let's see, I think I'll do 2 oranges, maybe an apple here, and maybe I'll have a jar. You have to have a jar, right? So I'm just drawing these shapes out. I'll show you what I'm doing. And then maybe we'll have a pear here. Should we have a pear? And then maybe I'll have my apples or oranges on a little podium. And then maybe there will be a sheet behind it. I don't know, like a little sheet. Okay, and maybe this is going to be a table. So I'm going to show you up close what I did. So I did this little drawing here. It's nothing special. Just going to be, I guess, a jar, a pear, a peach, maybe 3 little oranges, and a pedestal. The point is, it doesn't matter what it is. I just want you to have this negative space around it where you just have these linear drawings, and you're always going to do that when you start your watercolor. Just makes it a little bit easier. And now we're going to choose the colors that we're going to put in these spaces. Okay, so I have my watercolor brush and I have my rag, and I also have my little rag here that I'm going to be wiping my brush off. So I'm going to wet my brush and I'm going to first do the background. And I think the background I'm going to do in this ochre. So I'm picking up ochre on my brush and I'll show you. I'm sorry, I'm doing this backwards because I'm not really looking, I'm painting sideways. So you can see on camera. And you can see how easy it is for this transition and to just put the color there. You can see that. There's no buckling of the paper. It looks really good. Um, and I'm probably going to bring that color. Let's just make it this whole wall. And you just want to practice doing your washes, doing this. And sometimes you'll need to pick up more water. Sometimes you don't. You're just going to pick up more paint, depending on how much. Maybe I want to put a little texture in here. So I'm going to go over some of the colors, and I kind of have that. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to dip my brush, wipe it off, and let me do it like this so you can see the palette better. Let's see if you can. Let's see if I do it like this. Okay. And now I'm going to bring this down. And now I'm just going to have some, let's make this a pear over here. So I'm going to remember I have my green. I'm going to move it over here. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to bring some yellow into it. So it's like a greenish yellow. And I'm going to have this little pear here. And I'm just doing this little wash. That's all I'm doing. Nothing special here. And maybe I'm gonna have a green apple here, but I'm gonna make this green really green. So I'm gonna use less water. Now, if I put too much, I can just dab it off with my rag, right? So this is my green apple here, and then maybe I'm gonna have some red apples here. Maybe this is gonna be red. Okay. And maybe this one is going to be, I don't know, maybe a mixture of the red. So we'll bring some red down here, clean our brush. We're gonna add some orange to it. Maybe we got this reddish orange color. What you got here? Okay. Now we got these three colors going on. Okay. And maybe this stand here is gonna be brown. I'm gonna take out some brown. And now I'm not really having that much water on my brush. I'm just as you can see, I'm picking up the paint and I'm not using that much water. I'm not going back to the water. We are brown. I'm gonna bring that down. And what I'm doing is what I call masking out. And I'm just kind of filling in these shapes. I'm going to go back and do detail. I don't have to do them that dark, right? And this is what you're going to continue to do. Maybe this is going to be a blue, maybe this is going to be that. But you want to do something like this, and you want to practice just kind of doing the shapes and filling in those spaces. And then you can go back into detail. Now I can go back, I'll show you up close, like to this area here, and I can bring in some shadows. But first I want to have the colors down. I want to have them very light, okay? And I really want you to practice that. The next thing that I want you to do is after you do, practicing that, you could practice something else. So first is this, then just doing a little tiny little sketch and putting the colors on the canvas. Then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to practice something that I call kind of sponging. Now you could do it with your sponge. Remember I said you're gonna do it's better if you have a sea sponge. If you don't have a sea sponge, what you could do is you could just go to the supermarket, and I'll show you. Now I'm not going to tape this down all the way. I'm just taping the side. Normally you would mask this all the way around. I'm just putting a little tape here for now. Well, so you can go to the supermarket, and I got this little plastic bag there for putting vegetables in, and I kind of squeeze it up like this. Okay, and I'm going to show you why we're going to use it. So let's just do a fast background here. And I'm going to let's use a large brush so you can see how to use it. So I'm going to dip it, I'm going to wipe it off, and let's say I'm going to pick up some yellow here. I'm just going to put this yellow all the way across here. Okay, and then I'm going to pick some more yellow up just so it gets a little bit darker, and I'm just going to keep doing that. Okay, now I have my yellow. The next thing under that, I think I'm going to have some blue. And when I'm doing things, I usually think of a contrast. So I said, maybe I'll use some like ultramarine blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue under here. And if I really want to make this white, I don't have to add white. I just add more water. So adding more water to it makes it really white. And I'm kind of going to move this here. And I'm dipping, wiping off. And I'm just picking up more color. And you just want to learn how to have not too much water in your brush. And you want to learn when to go back and add more water and when more color. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend these two where they meet very softly. And by doing that, I'm dragging the brush up and down. And just where they meet, I'm blending them. So I have this gradation here. You see that, this line. And now with the bottom, maybe I'm just going to add this brown. And I'll show you why I'm doing this in a minute. Okay. So I just have these three colors on the canvas. And if I use a smaller brush, I have to keep going back and getting more water, because you can see when I was using that large brush, this takes a longer time to move across the canvas. And I want to show you something. I'm going back up and I'm blending this brownish, this ochre, and I'm covering it a little bit with the blue. So I'll show you what that looks up close. You can see where they meet here. Now, what I'm going to do is we're not doing anything amazing at this point. I'm just showing you how to do different types of washes so you can practice. So let's just pretend we have a tree here, right? Maybe another tree here, another tree here. You could even do it with your watercolor pencils. And this is just these lines, okay? What I'm going to do is with my wrap, my saran wrap, I'm going to dip it in my water and wipe it off on my rag so it looks like this. And then I'm going to go into a tree color. So I have this green. And what I'm going to do, and you have to make sure that the saran wrap is wet. I'm going to wet, wipe off, and you have to make sure that you're really picking up the green, you see, on the edge of here. And then what you do, and I did another video too with this, with acrylics or oils, it works, either or. I want to make sure that this is kind of taped down. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dot it and I put it here. And I do it real fast, you see, and I get that tree, okay? So that is this kind of saran wrap here, okay? And then what I could do is I could go back with a watercolor pencil and define these lines. I could make this into a more definition maybe here. I could even use another brush where I have some shadows here coming on this side. So I see my light and my shadows, two different lines on the tree. But I could do this in a bunch of colors. I could put, I don't know, maybe you like cherry blossoms, right? You have pink and a little bit, or you're kind of doing that, but that's another thing. So that's a technique, and you could go back. If you go back, with a darker, more intense green, you could go back over it. So let's go back over it, and then it changes to this. Okay. So it all depends on really what kind of tree that you want, but I can do the trees rapidly like that. So again, this saran wrap. The other thing that you can do with the watercolors are you can take your brush. So let's take my brush. I'm going to use a different brush now. Let's use more rounded brush here. So we have flats, which come to a square, and we have rounds. I'm going to dip my brush, I'm going to pick it off, and let's just pick up the green again. This time we're just doing it with the brush. I'm going to dab, and I got a lot of green on this brush. And as you can see, the difference, with that. It's very wet, right? So I do like using the wrap better or a sponge. And I can dip and I can press it off and I get that. Okay. So it's something that you could try at home. Try to make these little trees real fast. The other thing that we can do with the watercolors are you should practice your lines. So you really want to practice making lines with the brush. So that's kind of like dipping the brush in the paint and trying to get we're going to change this now. Let's turn to the back. Oh, I'm all into recycling paper, right? So we'll do a line across here. And you want to practice holding your brush in different ways. So if I hold it at the end, I'm going to get a line like this. And you want to practice getting these wonderful straight lines. I do them because when I want to do water, like say for an example, I want to paint waves, I can practice doing these lines. I've done a lot of videos on painting waves and water. It's basically the same with acrylics, oils. You just have to you're just using a different medium and you're just practicing how to do these strokes. I'm doing them really large, but you'd have these strokes if you wanted to do water, okay? And you could use a smaller brush, then you'd have smaller brushes. So let's do something else now. Let's try And the lines are really important because you want to do them when you're doing foliage, right? If you're doing something live from a park, maybe you're outside and you're painting and you're doing a landscape. Okay, so let's try this. I'm going to do it this way. Let's change the surface. And I'm just going to do this wash. We're just going to do this for the background of the paper. I'm going to give ourselves this nice yellow wash that's happening here. I'm going to leave some white strokes in between of the paper. I didn't wet the paper. I'm just doing this super fast for you on camera. And when I say I didn't wet the paper, I'm dipping my brush in the water, but I mean I didn't pre-wet the paper. So I have these lines here, okay? Now the next thing is I'm not going to even clean my brush, but I'm going to pick up some red. I'm trying to do this. Let's go like this light. Let's see if I turn this light off. Will you still see it? Yes. So I'm going to draw this shape, and let's just pretend this is a flower shape. Okay. And then I'm going to dip my brush, and I'm just going to go in here, and I'm just going to loosely put the colors, you know, where I see them. And remember, you don't want your brush to have too much water on it. And you can, and I'm gonna use a crimson, just so I have a little bit of contrast for a shadow. Okay. And I'm gonna start filling in these areas here. What I'm just doing is I just have this shape of this make-believe flower that I'm just making up on camera for you. Okay. And the wonderful thing about watercolors too is you don't have to fill in everything. You know, you can leave some spaces. Those white spaces look really nice sometimes when you want to leave them. And let's give this, I haven't really cleaned my brush. I'm now going into brown here. Maybe we'll make this, I don't know, the middle of the flower. And I'm just doing these shapes super fast. Okay. Just kind of an outline, just for you to practice. Okay. And now what we're going to do is maybe we'll have this red. Okay. Let's get rid of this and blend it. I don't know. Now I'm going to draw with the tip of the brush. I have this outline here. And we're just getting the idea of this kind of flower. I'm just drastically changing each time so you can see how I can change it. Okay? Maybe this is going to be inside. We could have the bud here if you wanted. We can change it to be a rose, whatever it's going to be. Now, let's just move on and I'll show you what I'm going to do with the green. And when I'm doing this, I'm picking up different color greens at the same time. You see, so I can kind of blend that. So I have some light greens on my brush. And that's why it's good to have different color greens also on the palette. You know, you can go in there with a brown if you wanted. And anyway, this is just the outline. We're doing it in I did this in 2 seconds, right? Or 2 minutes, whatever. You can have some green up here, whatever you're going to do. In other words, I want you just to practice the outline of shapes. And I want to show you the good thing about watercolors. And I could change this flower totally. Say I wanted to make this more like a rose. I could change the type of flower. I could change it to a carnation. That's the wonderful thing about watercolors is you could always change the shape, you know. I can make this something totally different, okay? And then I want to go in here and I'd start defining, you know, my shadows here of the rose. And again, I'm just making this up out of my head. Okay, we can go into more detail. Okay, so something you can do, just like, again, I'm not really, unfortunately, I don't have anything to look at now. I'm not looking at anything because I'm painting sideways on the camera. So you can try something like that if you want, you know, and again, that's it. Okay, so now let's try something else. So we did the trees, right? And you're going to try this outline. You're going to try, again, this, right? You're going to do the mixing of the colors. And now, let's see what else we're going to do. So we can do sponging and wiping off. Now I want to show you one more thing. I have a lot of students, sometimes we go painting plein air outside. And we use a little bit of pointillism. So if you know pointillism, it's kind of like these little dots that you make with the brush. So I want to show you something. It's also called wax resist. So what you could do is you could take a candle and you could rub it here. I'll show you right now. So I'm going to get the candle. Hold on. Bear with me. Okay, I'll show you without the candle first because it's so hot that candle melted. That's how hot it is in this house. So I'll show you something else while we're doing that. So anyway, if I would rub the candle on here and drag my brush across, it's called wax resist, it wouldn't take. They also have masking fluid, but then you'd have to remove it. But I'm just going to make these little spots here. So I do use the, you know, videos where I'm painting live where you can see me, how I would start the canvas, but I'm just putting this bottom area down here. What I really want to do is I want to make waves, like pretending that we're in the sea. Maybe it's a windy day outside or something. Wow, I can't believe it's 95 degrees here today. That's a little bit too much for me. Okay, so I have now a yellow and I have this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up some blue. And I'm going to put the blue under the yellow. And I want it to be my brush to have a little bit of water in it so I can move this around.